Hello again, gang. We're going to spend some time today talking about an interesting approach to discussing Othello's race. While literary critics have studied Othello's character from many points of view, his ethnicity has been a popular topic for discussion. After all, the full title of the play is Othello, the Moor of Venice. Since the word Moor refers to Muslims from northwestern Africa and appears in the title of the play, it does seem that Shakespeare might have considered Othello's ethnicity important. Many critics who discuss Othello's ethnicity do so from modern perspectives. But race relations in 1604, which was when Othello was first performed, were very different than modern race relations. And throughout the semester, we've attempted to focus on how audiences from the era that the works were written in would view them. So let's take a look at race relations in Shakespeare's England and see what concepts the audience brought with them when they attended a performance of the play. The source for this presentation is literary critic Robin Headlam Wells. Iago tells Rodrigo in Act 1 that if we as humans didn't have reason to balance our sensual, passionate natures, there's no telling what kind of bizarre and possibly horrifying things we might do. And, of course, the play goes on to explore what happens when reason is overcome by passion. According to literary critic Robin Headlam Wells, the conflict between reason and passion demonstrated in the play reflects a conflict in perception that was growing throughout England and Europe. This conflict in perception dealt with the definition of civilized. As Western culture spread from Greece and Rome throughout Europe, it was accompanied by an attitude that saw Europe as civilized and the world outside of Europe as uncivilized, Wells says. She reminds us that one concept that postmodern literary criticism focuses on is the traditional literary model of a white male of European descent as the norm, and women and people of other cultures as those who are different from the norm. Those who aren't the norm are referred to in literary criticism as the other. And a great deal of modern literary criticism reads classical literature to see what it indicates about the nature of the other. Now, Othello's race and cultural background make him a representative of the other. Wells states that many critics have particularly focused on the color of his skin. White European culture during the Renaissance associated black with sin, and these associations are evident in the play. For example, Iago refers to devils and the blackest sin in Act 2, and even Othello says in Act 3 that his reputation has been ruined by Desdemona's cheating, so it's as black as his own face. Wells maintains that although modern critics have extensively discussed how the other is depicted in Shakespeare's plays, they have usually ignored political context that added meaning for the audiences who viewed performances of Othello during the Renaissance. One of those political contexts was a changing view of Africans. Our introduction to the character of Othello reflects the traditional view of blacks that was still held by many of Shakespeare's audience members and known to all of them. Before we even see Othello, Iago and Rodrigo present us with a depiction of him when they go to Brabantio's house. In attempting to horrify and enrage Brabantio, Iago refers to Othello as a black ram having sex with the white ewe of Desdemona, as a horse engaged in acts of bestiality with her, and as a man who was joining Desdemona to create the beast with two backs. Iago's references have the desired effect because he brings to Brabantio's mind the Renaissance stereotype of Africans as being sexually violent, overpowering, and insatiable, Wells says. This stereotype then brings to Brabantio's mind the widely held view of Africans as practitioners of unchristian black magic, who possess potions created from the unfamiliar resources of the unknown African jungles. These negative stereotypes of Africans were prevalent in England because very few Britons had had much experience with people from Africa, Wells tells us. Because there was so little personal experience with blacks, 17th century Britons based their views of blacks on literary and sociological publications of the time, Wells says. Africans, and Moors in particular, were depicted in sociological writings, myths, and legends as symbols of savagery, cruelty, and treason. And the view of Africans as barbarians was still widespread in England when Shakespeare wrote, Wells explains. Although these traditional myths and legends portrayed Africans as threatening savages, many of Shakespeare's audience members would also have learned of an alternate view, thanks to the work of Michel de Montaigne, one of the most influential writers of the French Renaissance, who was also known for popularizing the essay as a literary genre, Wells reports. In 1580, de Montaigne published a collection of 107 essays that were widely read throughout Europe, according to Wells. She goes on to say that in an essay titled Of the Cannibals, de Montaigne demonstrates that Africans were not savages, but actually people who lived in complex societies, some of which were superior to those in Europe. In fact, according to Wells, de Montaigne proposes that the Golden Age, which Renaissance Europe associated with the highly respected period of ancient Greece and Rome, wasn't an unattainable historical memory, but an idyllic reality existing in some African, South American, Asian, and other non-European societies. Obviously, de Montaigne's essay, which was based on his travels, presented an opposing view to the barbarism that European and British mythology had associated with Africans and Moors, Wells points out. Consequently, Wells says, Elizabethan audiences attending performances of Othello had in their minds the question of which was true about men of color. Were they huge, threatening, intimidating, uncivilized, beast-like practitioners of black magic? Or were they men of great dignity, who were as elegant and civilized as the Greeks and Romans of the Golden Age? Because of these mixed views of blacks and African cultures, Elizabethan audiences could easily see Othello the Moor as either a noble hero from a distinguished culture or a savage barbarian. And with the dignity of the character that the character displays, and then the passions that lead him to kill his wife, Othello could easily have been seen as either one of these or a combination of the two, Wells says. Now, as we've discussed, the first information that we get about Othello is Iago's description of him to Brabantio, which clearly aligns with the view of blacks as sexually threatening savages, Wells states. But in Act 1, Scene 3, Othello appears before the Senate, and although he says, "Rude am I in my speech," he addresses the Senate with poise, eloquence, and above all, reason. Wells maintains that Othello's interactions with the Senate clearly contradict Iago's depiction of him as a savage, and reveal him as noble, articulate, dignified, and a leader of men that reflects de Montaigne's writings. We also quickly learn that the Duke, the leader of the civilized citadel of Venice, holds Othello in very high regard. Othello's excellence as a military leader leads the Duke to charge Othello with defending the safety of Cyprus, even though a perceived betrayal of Brabantio's trust has just been revealed, Wells points out. Had Othello not long worked to gain a reputation of trustworthiness, the Duke might have been hesitant to assign such an important duty to a man whose character had just been questioned by Brabantio, who's a member of the Senate, Wells points out. But based on his long association with Othello, the Duke doesn't see Othello as a man ruled by his passions, but as a trusted decision-maker and leader of men. The charges of using black magic, which held with the traditional views of Africans as savages, have no impression at all on the Duke, and he doesn't hesitate to appoint Othello as the leader of the defense of Cyprus. Now, Othello's actions on Cyprus also could be viewed as supporting the concept of Africans as civilized leaders of men or as savages. From the time Othello arrives in Cyprus in Act 2, Scene 1, line 182, he demonstrates the characteristics of a noble leader of men, Wells points out. His greeting of Desdemona and the people of Cyprus demonstrate attention to social propriety, and his interactions with Cassio following Cassio's drunken fight demonstrate his ability as a wise, fair leader of men. But Well maintains that in Act 3, Othello undergoes a transformation from a man of pure rationality and intellect who deeply loves Desdemona to a man who is easily made jealous and provoked to violence. She states that one surprising aspect of this transformation is the speed with which it takes place. Now, of course, it's necessary to have changes that might actually occur in a person's life over a period of time take place rather quickly within the context of a play. But the effect of this dramatic compression is to emphasize the horror of Othello's metamorphosis, Wells says. Before Desdemona speaks to Othello about reinstating Cassio, there's no hint that the Moor suspects his wife is capable of infidelity. But then, in Act 3, Scene 3, line 344, Iago implies that the conversation between Desdemona and Cassio might indicate that there's something going on between them. And within just a few lines, Othello refers to his beloved as an excellent wretch and talks about how chaos would return if he stopped loving her, Wells points out. Now, once Iago sows the seeds of doubt in Othello's mind, the Moor's transformation is complete in only 300 lines, Wells states. This transformation changes him from a leader whose actions are based on reason to a violent man whose actions are based on passion. Although in Act 5, Scene 2, line 301, Othello says that he did, quote, not in hate, but all in honor, Wells maintains that that's not entirely true, because hatred is one of his motives for killing Desdemona. And his vow of revenge against her in Act 3, Scene 3, proves that. In that scene, he says in lines 447 and 448, in speaking of Cassio, whom he believes had cuckolded him, quote, "Oh, that the slave had 40,000 lives. One is too poor, too weak for my revenge." Now, as Well points out, this statement is not one of a man who is upholding honor for honor's sake. It's the statement of a man who's seething with rage and hatred. And his passionate desire for vengeance against Cassio soon encompasses his wife as well, so that he actually instructs the love he has for Desdemona to change to vengeful hatred in Act 3, Scene 3, beginning with line 450. Othello undergoes another rapid metamorphosis at the end of the play, when, after learning of Iago's treachery and realizing the mistake he's made, he repents killing Desdemona, Wells says. Once again, he returns to being the man of dignity that we've seen in Acts 1 and 2. And once again, he calls on the state to remember his service in battle in judging his value. These transformations in Othello's character present a balanced view of the opposing ideas about Africans and Moors that were prominent throughout Renaissance Europe, Wells concludes. Othello begins the play as a noble man, a representative of the rich culture and civilization in Africa that de Montaigne reported. But because of Iago's lies and deceptions, he's transformed into the savage that represents the opposing view of blacks as savages ruled by their emotions and passions, which was also widespread in Europe. Then, at the end of the play, the truth returns him to a man of dignity and a trusted hero. Shakespeare is often praised for his insight into human nature, which was at least 2 centuries ahead of its time. In Othello, he avoids placing Othello into either the category of the noble African or the savage barbarian. Instead, Othello's character indicates that blacks, Moors, and Africans, like all people, are capable of both great dignity and appalling savagery. In the final analysis, Shakespeare implies that matters such as age, race, nationality, and religion can never be the determining factors of a person's character, and that each of us is capable of both dignity and savagery. Our characters and experiences, not simple demographics, determine our choices, behavior, and worth. Okay, I hope this presentation gave you something new to think about in regard to Othello and enhanced your enjoyment of the play. If you have any questions, email me from an account other than Canvas at deborah.okie@csn.edu. We'll get together soon to discuss Iago. And if Desdemona and Othello represent balance, Iago represents, well, let's just say something else.